Alara pulled her sleeve down too late. The Duke had already seen it. A bruise, dark and wrong, wrapped around her wrist like a rope. He stood there on his horse, still as stone, and his eyes did not move from her arm. "Who did this?" he asked. His voice was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that made the birds in the trees stop singing. Alara looked up at him. She had delivered clean linens to this estate every week for 3 years, and never once had the Duke spoken to her directly. Dukes did not speak to laundresses. Dukes did not notice bruises on the wrists of women who worked with their hands. But this one did. "It is nothing, my lord," she said. "I fell against a door." It was a lie, and both of them knew it. The bruise was shaped like fingers. 4 fingers and a thumb pressed hard enough to leave a mark that would take 2 weeks to fade. The Duke's name was Edmund Hale, and the county of Thornfield had many opinions about him. Some said he was cold, because he rarely smiled. Some said he was proud, because he rode alone instead of joining the other gentlemen at their card games. Nobody had ever called him kind, because kindness was not something people expected from a man who owned half the land they stood on. But right now, looking at a laundress with a bruised wrist, something in his face had changed. It was small, a tightening around the eyes, a stillness that had not been there a moment before. "You fell against a door," he repeated. "Yes, my lord." "And which finger of the door left that mark shaped like a thumb?" Alara said nothing. There was nothing to say. She pulled her basket of folded linens closer to her chest, as if the fabric could hide the rest of her. The Duke dismounted. This surprised her more than anything else. Dukes did not get off their horses to speak with servants. They spoke down from a great height, the way people spoke to children or to dogs. But Edmund Hale stood on the same gravel path as her, at the same level, and his boots made a soft sound as he stepped closer. "I will not press you," he said. "Not today, but I want you to know that I saw it, and I do not forget what I see." Then he did something even stranger. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small purse of coins, more money than Alara earned in a month, and held it out to her. "For the linens," he said, though the linens were worth a fraction of that sum. Alara did not take it right away. Charity from a duke was its own kind of danger. People would talk. People always talked in a county this small, where every face was known and every secret eventually found its way into someone else's mouth. "I cannot accept that, my lord." "You can," he said, "and you will, because if you do not, I will simply leave it on the road behind you and the wind will decide who finds it. Better it goes to the person it was meant for." There was something in the way he said it that made refusal feel foolish. Alara took the purse. Her fingers brushed his for half a second, and she felt the roughness of a scar across his knuckles, a scar that did not belong to a man who spent his life indoors. "Thank you, my lord," she said. "Alara," he said, "that is your name, is it not? I have seen it written on the linen ledger." "Yes, my lord." "Edmund," he said, "not my lord, not today." She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing at all. She curtsied, the way she had been taught since she was a child, and turned to walk back toward the road that led to her cottage. Behind her, she heard him mount his horse again. She did not look back, but she could feel his eyes on her the entire way down the hill, and for the first time in a long while, she did not feel like she was walking alone. That night in the small cottage she shared with her mother, Alara sat by the fire and stared at the purse of coins in her lap. It was heavier than it looked, heavier in ways that had nothing to do with metal. Her mother, Margaret, watched her from the other chair, her knitting needles paused mid-stitch. "Where did that come from?" Margaret asked. It was not really a question. It was a warning wrapped in soft words. "The Duke," Alara said. Margaret's needles stopped completely. "The Duke gave you money." "For the linens." "Alara, linens do not cost that much and you know it." Alara wrapped her fingers around the purse and did not answer. Her mother had lived long enough to know that when a powerful man gave a poor woman money, the reasons were rarely simple. But Margaret also knew her daughter, and she knew the bruise on her wrist had not come from any door. "Did he see it?" Margaret asked quietly. "The mark?" Ilara nodded. "And what did you tell him?" "That I fell." Margaret's face went pale in the firelight. She set her knitting down entirely now, her hands folding together in her lap like she was praying, though her eyes stayed fixed on her daughter. "You cannot keep saying that," Margaret whispered. "One day someone will look closer. One day someone will ask the right question the right way, and you will not have a lie ready fast enough." "He already asked, Mother. He asked exactly the right question." "And what did you tell him?" "I told him nothing, but he said he does not forget what he sees." The fire popped and cracked between them. Outside, the wind moved through the trees with a low sound like something breathing. Ilara thought about the man who had caused the bruise. He was not far away. He was never far away, not really, even when he was not standing in front of her. His name lived in the back of her mind like a splinter that would not come out, a small sharp thing that ached every time she moved wrong. Josiah Crane owned the cottage they lived in. He owned the small strip of land behind it, and the well they drew water from, and in some way that felt too large to argue with, he seemed to believe he owned a piece of Ilara too. Every month when the rent came due, he found new ways to remind her that the roof over their heads was a gift he could take back whenever he pleased. Sometimes the reminder was a look. Sometimes it was a hand on her arm that stayed too long. 2 nights ago, when she had been late with the coin, the reminder had been the bruise now hidden beneath her sleeve. Ilara had told no one, because telling someone meant admitting how trapped she truly was. A widow's daughter with no land of her own, no husband to stand beside her, and a mother whose health had been fading since the winter before last. There was no version of the story where speaking up made things better. There was only a version where Crane grew angrier, and the rent grew steeper, and the roof over their heads grew less certain. But now the Duke knew, or at least the Duke suspected, and suspicion in the hands of a man that powerful was not nothing. "He will forget," Margaret said, though her voice did not sound certain of it. "Great men have great concerns. A laundress with a bruise is not one of them, not after tonight." Ilara wanted to believe her mother. She wanted to believe that Edmund Hale would ride back to his enormous house and think of taxes and horses and the business of running an estate, and that her small bruised wrist would fade from his memory as easily as it would fade from her skin. But she remembered the stillness on his face, the way his jaw had tightened just slightly, like a man holding back words he had already decided not to say yet. She remembered the scar on his knuckles, and the way his voice had dropped so low it barely disturbed the air between them. Men like that did not forget. She did not know how she knew this. She simply did. She placed the purse of coins on the small wooden table between them, the way a soldier might lay down a weapon they were not yet ready to use. "We will need it for the rent," she said, "whatever else happens." Margaret picked the knitting back up, her hands trembling slightly as she found her rhythm again. "And what happens if Josiah Crane hears that the Duke of Thornfield is asking questions about you?" Ilara had not thought of that. Now that she did, a small cold feeling settled into her stomach, sitting right beside the fear she already carried every single day. If Crane heard that a duke had noticed her, had spoken to her, had given her money in front of witnesses on the estate road, he would not see protection in it. He would see a threat to something he believed belonged to him. And men like Josiah Crane did not respond well to threats against the things they believed they owned. Ilara sat by the fire long after her mother had gone to bed, watching the flames eat through the last log, thinking about a duke who did not forget what he saw, and a landlord who did not forgive what he could not control. Somewhere between those two men, she understood, her life was about to change in ways she could not yet predict. She only knew. As the fire burned down to embers, that there would be no going back to the woman who quietly hid her bruises and said nothing at all. That woman had already been seen, and being seen, she was beginning to understand, was the most dangerous and most powerful thing that had happened to her in years. 3 days passed with no word from the estate, and Alara began to believe her mother was right. Great men had great concerns. Perhaps the Duke had already forgotten the laundress on the road, the same way a person forgets a stone they step over on a long walk. Then, on the fourth morning, a rider came down the lane on a horse that did not belong to any farmer in Thornfield. He wore the Duke's colors, deep green trimmed with silver, and he stopped in front of the cottage without dismounting. "A message for Alara Winters," he said, holding out a folded paper sealed with wax. Alara's hands shook slightly as she took it. Her mother stood in the doorway behind her, wiping flour from her palms onto her apron, watching with an expression that was half curiosity and half fear. The rider did not wait for a reply. He turned his horse and rode back the way he had come, leaving Alara standing in the lane with a letter that felt far too heavy for a single sheet of paper. She broke the seal with careful fingers. The handwriting inside was neat, controlled, the kind of writing that came from a man who had been taught penmanship as a child and had never let the habit slip. The letter asked her to come to the estate that afternoon, not as a laundress delivering linens but as a guest, invited through the front entrance rather than the servant's door. It was signed simply Edmund. Alara read it twice before she folded it closed again. Behind her, Margaret had gone very quiet, the kind of quiet that carried more worry than any lecture could have. "You do not have to go," Margaret said finally. "I know," Alara answered. But even as she said it, she understood that she would go anyway. Something had shifted on that road 4 days ago, something that could not simply be folded up and tucked away like a letter in a pocket. The Duke had seen her suffering, and instead of looking away the way everyone else always did, he had asked a question that no one had ever bothered to ask her before. Now it seemed he intended to ask it again. The front entrance of Hale Manor was not built for people like Alara. The doors alone stood twice her height, carved with vines and lions that seemed to watch her as she climbed the stone steps in her one clean dress, the only one without a patch at the hem. A footman opened the door before she could knock, as though she had been expected down to the very minute. Inside, the hall was cool and quiet, filled with paintings of stern-faced ancestors who looked down from their frames with the same distant judgment she imagined the whole county held for a laundress walking through a front door meant for lords and ladies. Edmund was waiting in a smaller room near the back of the house, one with tall windows that let in soft afternoon light. He stood when she entered, which surprised her again. Men of his rank did not usually stand for women of hers. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Your letter did not leave much room to refuse, my lord." "Edmund," he corrected gently, "and it was not meant to be a command, only an invitation I hoped you would accept." She sat when he gestured to a chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap the way they always were when she felt out of place, which was almost everywhere in this house. A servant brought tea, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence filled only by the soft clink of porcelain. "I made inquiries," Edmund said finally, "about your landlord." Alara's stomach tightened. "My lord, I never told you his name." "You did not need to. There is only one man in Thornfield who collects rent the way a wolf collects sheep. Josiah Crane has a reputation, even among men who prefer not to notice such things." "What kind of inquiries?" "The kind that reveal a great deal," Edmund said. He set down his cup with a quiet precision that suggested he had rehearsed this conversation more than once before she arrived. "Your family owes him a debt on the cottage, a debt that grows a little larger every season, in ways that never quite match what should be owed." Alara's face went warm with something between shame and anger. She had never told anyone the exact numbers. The The way the debt seemed to multiply no matter how much she and her mother scraped together each month. It was humiliating to hear it spoken aloud by a man who had never once had to wonder where his next meal would come from. "You had no right to look into my affairs," she said, though her voice trembled more than she wanted it to. "You are right, I did not," Edmund admitted. "But I could not stop myself. When I saw that mark on your wrist, I understood it was not the first, and I suspected it would not be the last unless someone intervened. I chose to be that someone, whether or not you asked me to be." Alara stood, her chair scraping softly against the polished floor. "And what do you intend to do with this information, my lord? Ruin him publicly? Humiliate my family further by making our poverty a subject of gossip in every parlor in the county?" "No," Edmund said, standing as well, closer now than the distance between chairs had allowed. "I intend to buy the debt." The words landed strangely in the quiet room, as if they belonged to a different conversation entirely. "Buy it," Alara repeated. "Every shilling your family owes Josiah Crane, I intend to purchase from him directly, through my solicitor in Bath. Once the debt belongs to me, Crane no longer has any claim over your cottage, your land, or you. He becomes nothing more than a man who once lent money and was repaid in full." Alara stared at him, searching his face for the trick she felt certain must be hidden somewhere in his offer. Powerful men did not simply erase the debts of poor families out of kindness. There was always a cost, even when it was not spoken aloud. "Why?" she asked simply. Edmund was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. "Because I have spent a great many years watching this county from a distance," he said finally. "Attending dinners, signing papers, riding the same roads without truly seeing the people who walk them. And then one afternoon I saw a woman with a bruise on her wrist, lying to protect the man who caused it because the alternative felt more dangerous than the lie itself. I could not unsee that. I did not want to." "You barely know me." "No," he agreed. "I do not. But I know cruelty when it leaves a mark, and I know that a man with the means to stop it and the choice not to is no better than the one causing the harm." Alara sat back down slowly, her legs suddenly unsteady beneath her. The offer felt enormous, too large to hold in both hands at once. A life without Crane's shadow over every unpaid coin. A cottage that belonged fully to her mother, with no debt hanging over the roof like a storm that never quite broke. "There will be talk," she said quietly. "If people learn a duke settled a laundress's debts, they will not imagine kindness. They will imagine something else entirely." "Let them imagine," Edmund said. "I have never much cared what this county imagines about me. I do not intend to start now. But I have to live here, my lord. My reputation is the only thing I own outright, the one thing Crane has never managed to take from me. If it is damaged by rumor, it will not matter that the rumor is false." Edmund considered this, and for the first time since she had entered the room, uncertainty crossed his features, as though he had not fully weighed this cost before making his offer. "Then I will do it quietly," he said, "through the solicitor, with no names attached beyond legal necessity. Crane will simply receive payment and lose his hold over your family. He need not know where the money came from, and neither, if you prefer it, does anyone else in Thornfield. And if he asks, then he will be told the debt was purchased by an interested party who wishes to remain unnamed. Men like Crane rarely question money that arrives to make them richer. He will take his payment and think no further on the matter." Alara turned the offer over in her mind, searching every angle for the danger she still could not quite believe was absent. It seemed impossible that a man of his standing would ask nothing in return, expect nothing, want nothing beyond the simple satisfaction of undoing a wrong he happened to witness on a dusty road. "Why does this matter so much to you?" she asked again, quieter this time, truthfully. Edmund walked to the window, his back to her for a moment. Looking out over the grounds that stretched far beyond, what anyone family could ever need. My own mother, he said, endured something similar many years ago before my father died and I inherited the title that allowed me to finally stop it. I was young, too young to help her the way I wished I could have. I have carried that helplessness for a long time, Alara. When I saw your wrist, I did not see a stranger. I saw a chance to do something I could not do then. The room fell silent again, but this silence felt different from the one before, heavier and somehow warmer at the same time. I accept, Alara said finally, not because I trust easily, my lord. I do not. But because my mother deserves to sleep without fear of the knock at our door, and I have not been able to offer her that peace on my own. Edmund turned back to face her, and something in his expression eased, as though a weight he had been carrying since that first afternoon on the road had finally begun to lift. Then it is done, he said. By the end of the month, Josiah Crane will hold no claim over your family. I only ask one thing in return. Alara's guard rose instantly. What is that? That you allow me to check on you occasionally. Not as your landlord, for I have no wish to become that. Simply as a man who would like to know that the debt he purchased did not simply replace one form of worry with another. It was, Alara thought, a strange kind of request, gentler than anything she had expected, and somehow more unsettling because of how little it demanded. She studied his face for a long moment, searching for the catch she still half believed must exist. I suppose, she said slowly, that would be acceptable. For the first time since she had known him, the Duke of Thornfield smiled, and it was not the cold, distant expression the county whispered about at dinner parties. It was small and real, and it reached all the way to his eyes. Neither of them could have known, in that quiet room filled with afternoon light, how quickly the county would learn of the arrangement, or how differently the story would be told once it left these walls. The first sign that something had changed came from the baker's wife, a woman named Nora who had known Alara since childhood and had never once, in all those years, looked at her the way she looked at her now, across the counter, with a mixture of curiosity and something sharper underneath it. I heard the strangest thing, Nora said, wrapping a loaf of bread in cloth with more attention than the task required. That Josiah Crane received a visit from a solicitor out of Bath, that his hold on certain properties in this county has quietly changed hands. Alara kept her expression as still as she could manage. I would not know anything about that. Wouldn't you? Nora said, raising an eyebrow. Because I also heard that a certain duke was seen speaking with you on the estate road not 2 weeks past, speaking with you, Alara, not simply passing by. He asked about the linens. For 20 minutes. Alara took her bread and left the shop faster than politeness allowed, her face burning the entire walk home. She had known, somewhere in the back of her mind, that a secret this size could not stay buried for long in a county where everyone's business belonged to everyone else. But knowing it and living it were two very different things. By the following week, the whispers had grown legs of their own. In the market square, in the churchyard after Sunday service, in every doorway where 2 or more women gathered to exchange news, the story of the Duke and the laundress passed from mouth to mouth, changing shape a little more each time it moved. Some said Edmund had fallen in love with her the moment he saw her on the road, struck the way men in old stories were struck by a glimpse of the right face at the right moment. Others said something far less kind, that a poor woman had found herself a wealthy protector the way certain women always seemed to manage, through means that respectable ladies did not care to name aloud. Alara heard both versions eventually, and neither one felt true, though the second one wounded far more than the first. Her mother noticed the change first, the way Alara flinched now at every knowing glance from a neighbor, the way she had begun taking the longer path to market simply to avoid the baker's shop and its endless supply of gossip. You cannot hide from this, Margaret said one evening, setting down her needlework with the same seriousness she had shown the night the bruise first appeared. The talk will not stop because you avoid the square. I know that, Alara said, more sharply than she intended. Then what will you do? Alara did not have an answer, not that evening, and not for several days after. She continued her work delivering linens, though the walk to the estate now felt different, heavier somehow, as though every villager she passed along the way was silently cataloging the visit for later discussion. It was on one such delivery, nearly 3 weeks after the debt had quietly changed hands, that she finally confronted Edmund about the cost of his kindness. She found him in the stable yard, checking the shoe of a gray mare with the same careful attention he seemed to give everything, whether it was a horse's hoof or a stranger's debt. He looked up when she approached, and something in her face must have told him this was not a social visit. "You have heard the talk," he said before she could speak. "The whole county has heard the talk. My name is spoken now in every shop and every church pew, and not with kindness. You said you did not care what Thornfield imagined about you, my lord, but I do. I have to live here. I have to walk these streets long after you have returned to matters far more important than a laundress's reputation." Edmund set down the mare's hoof gently and straightened, his expression harder to read than usual, something between guilt and frustration crossing his features in quick succession. "I did not intend for this," he said. "I asked the solicitor for discretion." "Discretion does not exist in Thornfield," Alara said. "Someone always sees. Someone always talks. You forgot that a woman like me does not have the luxury of a reputation that repairs itself with time and title. Mine is the only thing that was ever fully my own, and now it is being picked apart in every doorway in the county." "Then let me fix it," Edmund said quickly. "I will make a public statement. I will explain the debt, the reasons, everything, so that no one is left to imagine something uglier than the truth." "And you think the truth will save me?" Alara said, her voice rising slightly despite herself. "A duke settling the debts of a laundress he barely knows. Do you truly believe that explanation will quiet anything, my lord? It will only confirm every suspicion already whispered in every corner of this county." Edmund was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost its usual composure, replaced by something rawer underneath. "Then tell me what you want me to do," he said, "because I refuse to simply stand by and watch you suffer for an act of kindness, Alara. I have already stood by once in my life while someone I loved was harmed, and I promised myself I would never do it again." The mention of his mother again caught her off guard, softening the edge of her anger just slightly, though the frustration underneath it remained. "I do not know what I want," she admitted finally. "I only know that things were simpler before you noticed my wrist on that road. Simpler and worse, but simpler." "Would you rather I had not noticed?" Edmund asked quietly. Alara opened her mouth to answer, and found to her own surprise that she could not honestly say yes. Before she could find any words at all, the sound of hooves on gravel interrupted them both, and a rider came into the stable yard at a pace that suggested urgent news rather than a casual visit. It was one of Edmund's men, the same rider who had delivered the first letter weeks earlier, though his face now carried none of the calm professionalism from that day. "My lord," the rider said, dismounting quickly, "there is trouble at the Crane property. Josiah Crane has been drinking since morning by all accounts, and he has been telling anyone who will listen that he intends to reclaim what he calls his rightful due, one way or another." Alara felt the color drain from her face. Reclaim it from whom? The rider glanced at her uncertainly, clearly unsure whether he should speak freely in front of her. "Say it," Edmund said, his voice sharpening into something commanding that Alara had not heard from him before. "From the Winters family, my lord. He is saying the debt was stolen from him unfairly, and that he intends to collect what he believes he is still owed, regardless of who now holds the paperwork." The stable yard suddenly felt very small around Alara. the earlier argument about gossip and reputation shrinking into something distant and unimportant compared to the fear now closing around her chest. She thought immediately of her mother, alone in the cottage, with no one nearby to help if Crane arrived in the mood the writer was describing. "My mother," she said, already turning toward the road. "I will send men with you," Edmund said, already moving toward his own horse, his earlier softness replaced by a hard, focused urgency. "But Alara, listen to me. Crane is a coward at heart, the way most cruel men are. He has never faced consequence for anything he has done, and that has made him bold in ways that will not survive contact with real resistance. I intend to make certain he finally meets that resistance today. You cannot simply ride in and threaten him, my lord. That will only make things worse." "I do not intend to threaten him," Edmund said, swinging up into his saddle with practiced ease. "I intend to remind him precisely how little power remains in his hands, and I intend to do it in front of enough witnesses that no rumor born from today will paint you as anything other than exactly what you are. A woman who was wronged, and who is finally being protected instead of ignored." Alara mounted the horse offered to her by one of the estate grooms, her hands trembling slightly around the reins, though whether from fear or something else entirely, she could not have said. As they rode out of the stable yard together, toward the small cottage where her mother waited unaware of the storm approaching, Alara understood that whatever quiet, uncertain arrangement had existed between herself and the Duke of Thornfield was about to become something far more public, far more permanent, and far more dangerous than either of them could fully predict. The road stretched ahead of them, familiar in every curve and stone, yet it had never once felt this urgent beneath her before. Behind them, several of Edmund's men followed at a steady pace, their presence a strange and unfamiliar comfort against the fear coiling tighter in her chest with every passing mile. Somewhere ahead, Josiah Crane was drinking away the last of whatever restraint he had ever possessed, and Alara knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that the version of her life she had known until this point was about to end, one way or another, before the sun set over Thornfield that evening. The cottage came into view before the shouting did. Alara heard it first, a rough voice carrying across the fields, slurred and loud in a way that turned her stomach cold. Margaret stood in the doorway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, facing a man who swayed slightly on his feet at the bottom of the garden path. Josiah Crane was not a large man, but he carried himself like one when he had been drinking, his shoulders squared in a way that seemed to dare the world to challenge him. His coat was rumpled, his collar loose, and even from a distance Alara could see the flush of anger and spirits coloring his face a deep, unhealthy red. "You think you can simply erase what is owed to me," Crane was shouting as Alara's horse slowed to a stop at the edge of the garden. "Papers do not change what is right. This cottage, this land, everything on it belonged to my family's arrangement long before some fancy solicitor from Bath decided to interfere." "The debt has been paid, Mr. Crane," Margaret said, her voice steadier than Alara expected, though her hands, gripping the doorframe, betrayed her fear. "Paid in full and legally recorded. There is nothing left for you to collect." "There is always something left to collect," Crane said, taking an unsteady step closer to the doorway. Alara dismounted quickly, her feet hitting the ground before the horse had fully stopped, and she moved between her mother and Crane with a speed born entirely of instinct rather than plan. "That is close enough," she said. Crane's eyes swung toward her, and something in his expression shifted from generalized anger into something far more personal and far more unpleasant. "There she is," he said, his voice dropping into something almost mocking. "The little laundress who found herself a duke. Tell me, Alara, did you offer him the same courtesies you once offered me, or does a title simply buy better manners along with everything else?" The words landed like a slap, and Alara felt her face burn with humiliation and fury in equal measure. Behind her, She heard the sound of more horses arriving, and a moment later Edmund was on the ground, moving toward them with a controlled, deliberate stride that carried far more menace than Crane's drunken swagger ever could. "You will not speak to her that way," Edmund said, his voice low and even, though every word carried a weight that silenced the garden completely. Crane turned toward him, some of his bravado faltering now that the man himself stood before him, rather than existing only as a rumor, passed through taverns and market stalls. "My lord," Crane said, attempting a mocking bow that nearly cost him his balance, "come to admire your new charity project, have you?" "I have come," Edmund said, closing the distance between them with slow, measured steps, "to make certain you understand something you appear to have forgotten. The debt this family owed you no longer exists. The land, the cottage, and every person who lives within it are no longer within your reach in any capacity for any reason. Do you understand me?" "I understand that a rich man bought himself a pretty distraction," Crane spat, "and dressed it up as justice." The words had barely left his mouth when Crane lunged forward, whether toward Edmund or toward Alara. No one would later agree, the moment happening too fast for clear memory. What was certain was that his hand closed around Alara's wrist, the same wrist that had carried his bruise weeks before, and for one terrible instant she was thrown backward into every fear she had carried since that first painful grip on a night she had tried very hard to forget. Then Edmund's hand closed over Crane's wrist in turn, hard enough that Crane let go with a sharp gasp of pain and surprise. "You will not touch her again," Edmund said, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper, though it carried more force than any shout could have managed, "in this life." The garden fell completely silent. Even the birds seemed to have gone still, as though the entire county was holding its breath around this single frozen moment. Crane cradled his wrist against his chest, his earlier confidence draining out of him with every passing second under the weight of Edmund's stare. "You cannot threaten me," Crane said, though his voice had lost all its earlier conviction. "I have done nothing that would stand against me in any court." "Perhaps not in a court," Edmund said. "But you forget, Mr. Crane, that reputation is a currency in this county just as real as any coin, and yours has already begun to spend itself thin. Every man who works your remaining land, every merchant who extends you credit, every neighbor who greets you politely at church, they will all learn today exactly what kind of man you are, in front of exactly the kind of witnesses who will make certain the story does not fade quietly. You spoke a great deal about what was owed to you a moment ago. Consider this the beginning of what you are now owed in return." Crane looked around the garden as though seeing, for the first time, the small crowd that had gathered along the lane during the commotion, drawn by the shouting the way any gathering always drew curious neighbors in a county this size. Faces he recognized from church, from the market, from years of quiet transactions and unspoken threats, all watching him now with expressions that held no sympathy at all. Without another word, Crane turned and stumbled back down the lane, his earlier bravado replaced by something smaller and far less certain, the sound of quiet murmuring following him the entire way. Alara stood very still in the garden, her wrist throbbing faintly where Crane's hand had gripped it, though the pain felt distant compared to the storm of emotion moving through her. Edmund turned to her immediately, his earlier hardness melting away into something gentler, his hands hovering near her shoulders as though uncertain whether touching her again, even in comfort, would be welcome after what had just happened. "Are you hurt?" he asked quietly. "No," Alara said, though her voice shook slightly as she said it. "No, I do not think so." Margaret rushed forward from the doorway, pulling her daughter into an embrace that said everything words could not, and over her mother's shoulder, Alara watched Edmund step back to give them space, his expression unreadable in the fading afternoon light. The crowd along the lane slowly began to disperse, though Alara knew, with the same certainty she had felt on the ride over, that this moment would not fade quickly from Thornfield's memory. If anything, It had likely changed the story being told about her yet again, though which direction it would turn this time remained impossible to predict. That evening, once the estate men had confirmed the road was clear, and Crane had returned to his own property without further incident, Edmund lingered in the small garden long after his men had gone, standing near the fence as though reluctant to leave despite having every reason to return home. "I owe you an apology," he said finally, when Alara came to find him there. "For what?" "For believing discretion could ever exist in a place like this. For not anticipating how quickly kindness could be twisted into something ugly by people with nothing better to occupy their attention. And for allowing you to be humiliated today, in your own garden, by a man who should have lost the right to speak to you at all the moment I settled that debt." "You did not allow anything," Alara said. "Crane made his own choices today, the same as he always has. You are not responsible for his cruelty, my lord, only for what you chose to do in response to it." "Edmund," he corrected softly, though there was less insistence in it this time, more a quiet request than a demand. "Edmund," she repeated, and something in the way she said it, testing the shape of his name without a title attached, seemed to settle something unspoken between them. They stood together in the fading light, the garden quiet now except for the distant sound of evening birds returning to their usual song, as though the entire world had simply resumed its normal rhythm the moment danger passed. Neither of them spoke for a long while, the silence comfortable in a way that surprised Alara, given everything that had happened only hours before. "What happens now?" she asked eventually. "That," Edmund said, "depends a great deal on what you want to happen. I have already overstepped more boundaries than I intended when I first saw that bruise on your wrist. I have no wish to overstep further without your consent." Alara considered the question carefully, aware that whatever answer she gave would likely determine the shape of everything that followed, not only for herself, but for her mother, for the cottage that finally belonged fully to their name, and for the strange, unexpected connection that had grown between herself and a man the entire county had once believed incapable of warmth. "I want," she said slowly, "to stop being afraid of what people will say before I have even decided what I actually feel." Edmund nodded, as though this answer satisfied him more than any declaration of affection could have. "Then that is precisely where we will begin." The sun continued its slow descent behind the hills surrounding Thornfield, painting the garden in deep gold light, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Alara felt something loosen in her chest that had nothing to do with fear at all. Autumn arrived in Thornfield the way it always did, slowly at first and then all at once, turning the fields gold and the evenings sharp with the first real chill of the season. The story of what had happened in the winter's garden had, as Alara predicted, spread through the county within days, though not in the direction either she or her mother had feared. Word of Crane's public failure traveled faster than any rumor about scandal ever could. Merchants who once extended him easy credit began asking for payment in full before delivering goods. Neighbors who had once nodded politely in his direction now found reasons to cross the street rather than exchange greetings. Within a month, Crane had quietly sold what remained of his holdings and left Thornfield altogether, moving to some distant town where his reputation had not yet arrived ahead of him. Alara heard the news of his departure from Nora, of all people, delivered across the same bakery counter where the earliest gossip about herself and Edmund had first taken root. "Good riddance," Nora said, wrapping a loaf of bread with none of the earlier sharpness in her expression. "Whatever people once whispered about you and the Duke, Alara, I think we can all agree now that the whispering missed the point entirely." Alara found herself smiling, a real smile, unguarded in a way she had not allowed herself in the bakery for a very long time. Her relationship with Edmund had continued in the months since that difficult afternoon in the garden, though it had grown slowly, carefully. The way something delicate grows when both people involved understand exactly how easily it could be damaged by moving too quickly. He visited the cottage often, sometimes bringing small gifts for Margaret's health, sometimes simply sitting with them by the fire, listening to Margaret's stories about the county the way he never had time to when he was younger and too busy managing an estate to notice the people living within its borders. It was on one such evening, as autumn began giving way to the first cold breath of winter, that Edmund arrived at the cottage carrying a folded document rather than his usual small gift, his expression carrying a seriousness that immediately caught Alara's attention. "What is that?" she asked, setting down the mending in her lap as he took his usual seat across from her by the fire. "An amendment to my will," Edmund said simply. Alara stared at him, certain she had misheard. "Your will?" "I have spent the past several weeks with my solicitor," he explained, "arranging a provision that ensures your independence regardless of what happens between us going forward, regardless of whether we marry, regardless of what the future holds in any direction. A portion of the estate, set aside specifically for you, held in your name alone, answerable to no one but yourself." Alara set the document on her lap without opening it, her hands trembling slightly around the edges. "Edmund, I do not understand. Why would you do this?" "Because I watched a man believe he owned you simply because you owed him money," Edmund said quietly. "I will not have you ever wonder for even a moment whether your security depends on my continued affection or my continued presence in your life, or anything at all beyond your own name and your own choices. Whatever happens between us, Alara, I never want you to feel trapped again. Not by Crane, not by circumstance, and certainly not by me." Alara opened the document with careful fingers, reading through legal language she only partly understood, though the meaning underneath it came through clearly enough. Land, income, a portion of the estate's holdings, all set aside permanently, independently, protected from any future circumstance that might otherwise leave her vulnerable again. "This is too much," she said finally, though her voice carried more wonder than protest. "It is precisely enough," Edmund said. "No more, no less than what any person deserves, regardless of the family they were born into or the debts once hanging over their door." Margaret, sitting quietly in her usual chair, watched the exchange with tears gathering in the corners of her eyes, though she said nothing, allowing the moment to belong fully to her daughter. The harvest fair arrived in Thornfield a few weeks later, the entire county gathering in the town square for an event that marked the turning of the season, filled with music, food, and the kind of easy laughter that only comes when the hardest work of the year has finally been completed. Alara arrived on Edmund's arm, in full view of every neighbor, every merchant, every person who had once whispered about the strange arrangement between a duke and a laundress. There was no explanation offered, no formal announcement, no attempt to define precisely what existed between them for the benefit of curious onlookers. Alara simply walked beside him through the fair, her wrist, fully healed now, resting easily against his sleeve, and for the first time since that first frightened lie about a door, she felt no need to hide anything at all. Nora found her near the cider stalls, her expression carrying the particular satisfaction of someone who had watched a story unfold exactly as they always suspected it might. "I told everyone from the beginning," Nora said, "that there was more to the story than mere charity." "You told everyone the opposite, if I recall correctly," Alara said, laughing despite herself. "Details," Nora said, waving her hand dismissively. "The point is, I always knew something real was happening. I simply enjoyed watching the county catch up." Alara glanced across the fair to where Edmund stood speaking with a group of local farmers. His expression relaxed in a way she rarely saw from him during his earlier, more distant years managing the estate. He caught her eye across the crowd and offered a small, private smile that belonged entirely to the two of them, regardless of how many people surrounded them at that moment. Later that evening, as the fair began winding down and lanterns were lit against the gathering darkness. Alara and Edmund walked together along the edge of the square, away from the noise and music, toward the quiet path that led back toward the estate. "Do you ever wonder," Alara asked, "what would have happened if you had simply ridden past that day, the way you had ridden past me 100 times before?" Edmund considered the question seriously, the way he considered most things. "I think about it sometimes," he admitted. "I imagine you would still be living under Crane's shadow, still lying about bruises, still believing your suffering was simply the price of survival in a world that offers little mercy to women without means. And I imagine I would still be exactly the man this county always believed me to be, cold and distant, riding past problems I had trained myself not to see." "And now," Edmund said, stopping on the path and turning to face her fully, the lantern light catching the seriousness in his expression, "I am a man who finally understands that seeing suffering and choosing to act on it is not weakness, whatever my upbringing once taught me. It is, I believe, the only thing that gives a life of privilege any real meaning at all." Alara reached up, without fully deciding to, and touched the scar across his knuckles, the same rough mark she had noticed the very first day their fingers brushed over a purse of coins on a dusty road. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for asking the right question." "Thank you," Edmund answered, "for eventually telling me the truth." They stood together on the quiet path, the sounds of the fatting harvest fair drifting behind them, the entire county now fully aware of the story that had unfolded between a duke and a laundress, though none of them, not even Nora with her endless certainty, could have predicted exactly how it would end. Not with scandal, not with ruin, but with a woman who no longer needed to hide her bruises, standing beside a man who had finally learned to stop riding past the things that mattered, both of them walking forward together into whatever came next, unafraid, at last, of what anyone else might choose to say about it.